chatted for a little while, but it was sort of stuffy in her room, and I could tell that she was getting sleepy. So we didn't talk for too long, and we just had communion right away. And while I was saying the words of institution, I noticed that she was falling asleep. And honestly, it was a little discouraging or frustrating. I mean, I couldn't help but think, you know, when I took vows, this isn't what I imagined. But then two things happened. I noticed the woman in the hallway, one of the employees vacuuming. I remember this. And I noticed the sound from birds chirping coming in through the window. I just noticed those two things, but then what happened was, it wasn't like something I thought. It was like I was filled with this knowledge that there was more going on than I had realized. And then, the only way I can think to describe this is it's like there was some light coming in through the doorway from a window, and it was like it came alive. And everything had its own energy. It felt like the air was trembling. I kept saying the words of communion, and just as quickly as it had started, it was over. In fact, I don't even think I really realized it until it was over. That's what a revelation is. And one of the reasons that I tell that story is because I'd be willing to bet there's more experiences like that in the pews. Like you've all had experiences like that, more than we know. Because revelation is not as strange or frightening as we're worried it is, as a lot of people make it out to be. Annette and I were just talking about that before church started. What John's revelation aims to do is to shake us awake, to get us to see what's really going on. Because there's more than we see or know. John's revelation hopes to get us to see the forces that would resist God's purpose, and also to get us to see God's refusal to leave us to those forces. All the ways God keeps showing up. John's revelation wants us to take stock of what's really happening when we gather here to pray and sing, and even what's at stake when we fail to as well. Because let's be honest, there's a lot that would keep us from gathering, isn't there? There's all the obligations. You know, I've gotten to know you, and I know how busy you all are. There's all the pressure from activities our children get involved in. And it's a real pressure like, well, maybe they'll resent me if they don't get this opportunity, or maybe another parent will judge me if they're not in this opportunity. These real forces. And there's also just wanting one blessed morning off. And I'm not going through these examples to set up straw men or to make anyone feel guilty. I'm saying them because they're real forces. And I use that word intentionally, forces. I mean, John's trying to get us to see these forces. And what John knows is that they're not trifling. Never have been. A lot of times, I think we think that the challenges that the church faces in 2017 are unlike any challenge the church has ever faced before, that all of the choices to do something else is new. But that couldn't be further from the truth. And one of the reasons this is because the forces of what John calls them, death and Hades, have always arrayed themselves against God's purposes, God's people. In fact, it only took 1 or 2 generations after Jesus' ascension for the luster to come out of the shine of Christianity. That's about when the book of Revelation is written, just 1 or 2 generations after Jesus' ascension. And what these Christians are having to learn is the hard lesson of life together over the long haul. Of putting up with each other week after week, and month after month, and meeting after meeting. Because we should know that's a hard lesson. But it wasn't just the internal struggles either, because there were the external ones too. Because back then, being a Christian was met with suspicion. It was met with suspicion. You see, the early Christians of their day weren't entirely resigned to the idolatry that they perceived around them. Like, for instance, their coins had fine words on it, like "In God we trust," but the images weren't of God or God's people. It was of political leaders. Or the civic gatherings, the way everyone would be gathered together and asked to give their allegiance. These first Christians, they weren't sure about all of that. But to the onlookers, these Christians' concerns seemed to be just scruples. And they were scruples over the fabric of society. The official charge that was brought against these Christians was atheism, a refusal to blindly follow the gods of their day, gods of society and culture. John says that he's on this island of Patmos. He's exiled there. He's landed on the wrong side of the wrong people. Probably because of these issues. And it was all of that. This hard lesson of life together, the pressure to fit in, having to bear the weight of suspicious looks day in and day out, that began to take their toll on these Christians. And little by little, and inch by inch, they toned down their witness. Jesus called it being salt and light. That they stopped trying to be so peculiar and tried more to fit in. And it wasn't long before the gap between, well, their mission statement and what they talked about during coffee hour got to be pretty conspicuous. And so their pastor, Pastor John, must have done all that he could to gin up these Christians, but to no avail. In fact, for all of his effort, all he had to show was his exile. His exile. One way or another, John landed on the wrong side of the wrong people, and he was made to live on this small island off of modern-day Turkey. Exiled on Patmos. And that was a relatively common punishment in Rome, and it was, well, they did the crucifixion, so exile's one of their more lenient forms of punishment. And this is where John is. This is what's come of it all. The pressure that these churches had to face, his pressure to keep them being this church, and it all ends. His call is stripped away, and he's made to live on this island. But one Sunday on this island, all of that changes. He's praying, and he hears something. He hears the voice. The voice. Right? We know how I like to do this. Not just any voice, but the voice. The voice of the risen Lord Jesus Christ. And when John turns to see the voice, he sees Jesus as he had never seen him before. Not just as a humble Galilean like in the movies. And not just as a moral teacher. Not just as a religious leader. But Jesus Christ exalted in all of his glory. Jesus Christ, the King of the cosmos, of the universe, of everything. And when John sees Jesus as he is now, he sees something else. When John sees Jesus as he is now, he sees his congregation for what they are. Not as frustrating, all too often half-hearted followers, but as lampstands in heaven, as candles in the menorah up in heaven. That's what the church looks like. And when he sees Jesus for who he is now, John also sees himself for who he is. Not as a disgraced pastor without a call, but as a preacher to those 7 congregations yet. What's more, he'd been given a sermon to preach. And it's a pretty good one, too. By God's grace, in the midst of everything, in the midst of the trials and the compromises, they all still had a vocation to be the people of God. To be the people of God on a hot summer day. To be the people of God when, someone shells up when they find out you go to church because they're worried they're going to get the riot act. To be the people of God when you think twice about saying you go to church because you don't want the person you're talking to shell up. To be the people of God in yet another meeting spent trying to figure out how to repave the parking lot or replaster the walls. This call to bear witness to Jesus abides through all of that because in the middle of the church stands Jesus Christ. Remember, in the middle of the menorah, he sees one like the Son of Man standing. In the midst of the church, Jesus Christ stands. In the middle of everything the church has to deal with and God's people have to deal with, Jesus Christ stands. And Jesus' revelation for us today is that in the middle of this, Jesus stands. In the middle of this, Jesus stands, because the revelation is no less true for the church in Ephesus then as it is for us today. John's revelation means to wake us up to all that's going on, all that we've grown dull to or failed to see. The cosmic significance of worship. That in the eyes of Jesus, what's happening looks like a candle in heaven. What we think is just the ordinary, dull push and pull of daily life, Jesus declares is the very stuff of God's invasion, and I like that word, invasion. Because the incarnation is God's invasion into here, to bring God's will here. And what it turns out to be is that the incarnation didn't just end at the humble stable, and it wasn't over at the terrible cross. That incarnation happens. That it happens here. That God invades this place. That God invades the world, and God promises to do it through here. Sisters and brothers, there's more going on than we know or see. God has not left us to our own devices. God is not the heavenly clockmaker who builds the earth and then steps away to let it tick-tock on its own. God shows up here in the form of Jesus Christ and in the Word made flesh. That's these words that you hear. Holy Spirit making Jesus come alive in these words. And the other thing that John wants us to know, and we all have an inkling of it, and I think a lot of times we get nervous to say it, but it's that we know Jesus Christ defeated the forces of death on the cross. But that doesn't mean they've walked away with a shrug. That they still rage. And we, bleary-eyed and hungry, thinking about what we'll have for dinner, we're blind to it so often. And so Jesus gives us a revelation. He calls you with ears to hear. Listen, wake up. I'm here in the midst of this, in the middle of you. That's what Jesus' message is for us this evening. That in the middle of the chaos, in the middle of the headlines, in the middle of the to-do list, in the middle of the agenda, in the middle of another meeting, in the middle of your stomach growling, in the middle of all you're thinking about that you've got to do, Jesus Christ is here. And so, when you come here, or when you go to a meeting, when you share the peace, when you leave from here, the forces that rage against God's purposes of goodwill for the earth may show up. But the one who overcomes them, the one who conquers them, as our translation put it. He stands in our midst. And so we have nothing to fear. Or like Paul put it, maybe we do fear a little. With fear and trembling, we work out our salvation. But we work it out assured that Jesus stands in our midst. Assured that he won't lose a single one of his sheep. Assured that he is here. Those with ears to hear,